Happy Constitution Day, everyone. We're so pleased you've joined us for this program today. This program is organized by the Task Force for American Democracy, Keep Our Republic, and the Society for the Rule of Law. The Task Force for American Democracy is a new organization dedicated to mobilizing the nation's 1.3 million attorneys and bar associations across the country to stand up for the rule of law and the Constitution. For 238 years, America's Constitution has guided our country and defined us as a nation of laws. When our democracy is tested, we draw strength from the Constitution as the bedrock to make our country more equal and more just for all our citizens. American democracy requires our constant care, vigilance, and full participation to determine the very future of our nation. Today, on September 17th, we celebrate Constitution Day. The Constitution begins with the phrase, "We the people," which stands as a powerful reminder that America was founded upon the principle that our government derives its power from its citizens and all their diverse voices. The foundation of our democracy is under attack. Our founders deliberately created a government based on the separation of powers, ensuring that the executive, legislative, and judicial branches would check and balance one another, and that people could hold power to account. But the formula for a liberal democracy, successfully deployed in Hungary, Turkey, and other autocracies, is now being pursued in the United States. The erosion of checks and balances follows the authoritarian playbook: polarize the public, demonize opposition, and sow chaos to confuse citizens into accepting autocratic rule. The judiciary, our third branch of government, has long stood as a bulwark for the rule of law. However, it is now under intense pressure. The entire justice system, including judges, lawyers, law schools, regulators, are being targeted. Every lever of influence is being used to bring this system to heel. Government contracts are being leveraged to coerce law firms. Owners of major media outlets are offered favorable terms to mute their criticism. Unfounded attacks are launched against judges and attorneys who challenge constitutional overreach. We as lawyers have sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and defend the rule of law. Since the 13th century, our profession has been grounded in the principle that no one, not even a ruler, is above the law. That commitment is now being tested. Today, we will discuss the why, the how, and the what. Today, we will discuss why the Constitution is important, how it impacts our daily lives, and what we can do to strengthen our democracy and the Constitution. So now, I would like to introduce my co-moderator, Greg Nunziata, who will give a short introduction and introduce the panelists. Greg is the Executive Director of the Society for the Rule of Law. Previously, he served as Chief Nominations Counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, playing a key strategic role in the confirmation proceedings of scores of federal judges and executive branch appointees. He also served as policy counsel to the Senate Republican Policy Committee and later as general counsel and domestic policy advisor to Senator Marco Rubio. Earlier in his career, he served in the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division and worked as a litigator in an international law firm. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning, Mary. Thank you for that kind introduction and for having me here. The Society for the Rule of Law is really thrilled to participate in this event today on Constitution Day. We, if you don't know us, are a group of conservative, libertarian, and other right-of-center lawyers who just believe deeply that the Constitution, the rule of law, and American democracy are more important than our policy or political preferences. So we'd love to partner with people of diverse perspectives in defense of those values. We also believe really strongly that the Constitution is not just for lawyers, it's for every American. And we love to engage in a conversation like this where we can help bring that to life on a Constitution Day. So I'd be pleased to introduce this amazing panel. I'll try not to go too long in their introductions. You could speak for 10 minutes about all they've accomplished each, and then we would lose our time for our discussion. But first, I'd like to introduce Judge Allyson Duncan. Judge Duncan is active in the Article 3 coalition of Keep Our Republic. Following a long career in public service and private practice, she served 15 years on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, 1 year on the North Carolina Court of Appeals, and prior to joining the bench, worked in employment and regulatory law. Maria Echaveste is a very busy woman, and we're glad to have her this morning. I want to apologize up front for Maria. She has to leave us about halfway through the program for some other commitments. So I hope we can get some of her wisdom before she does. She has been serving as president and CEO of the Opportunity Institute, has had various affiliations with UC Berkeley, and in her past, she also has some important public service, including serving as assistant to the president and deputy White House chief of staff in the Clinton administration. Bill Kristol, who was on the other side of the aisle from the Clinton administration in some important fights back in those days, is a member of the Task Force on American Democracy and editor at large of the Bulwark. He was the founder of the Weekly Standard and is a regular guest on leading political and commentary shows. Bill also spent some time in public service, serving as chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle and Secretary of Education William Bennett. Eric Liu rounds out our panel. He is the co-founder and CEO of Citizen University, which works to build a culture of powerful and responsible citizenship in the United States. He's also the founding director of the Aspen Institute's Citizenship and American Identity program and the author of many widely well-regarded books. Most recently, You Are More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen. Eric spent some time in public service as well as a speechwriter and policy advisor to President Bill Clinton. And with that, let's get to the program, Mary.
Yes, well, I'm going to start out and just ask each of you, why is the Constitution important to you personally, and what does it mean to you? I'll start with you, Maria.
Thank you, Mary. I'm glad to join this esteemed panel. The Constitution to me for two reasons. Well, number one is just take those words, we the people. When they were written, they did not mean to include me as a woman, me as a Latina. But the fact that we had a document then and founding documents that allowed us to expand what it means to be, who gets to be American. The second thing is that the Constitution lays out a way through our checks and balances, as Mary referenced, for us to resolve our disputes over policy directions in a peaceful way, elections, the how. So it's both we the people as this ideal, and also the processes, a peaceful way to resolve. And that is, I believe, fundamentally all Americans should understand. It matters to their daily lives.
Judge, I'll turn to you.
Rather like Mary, I suspect, I too was an outsider. I was born in North Carolina, Brown versus Board of Education. I would not be here but for as a consequence of the concept of judicial independence. I had very dear friends. One of my dear friends, Julius Chambers, was a lawyer who participated in the landmark school desegregation case, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg. And he was taught to start his car every morning, but leave the driver's side door open so that if there were a car bomb, he might escape death by being blown out the side. That's a horrifying lesson to have to learn, but it is an even more horrifying possibility that now federal judges are having pizzas delivered to their homes in the names of their children as an attempt to threaten them and let them know that there are eyes that are watching. So I think that is something we have to speak up for. We have to make people aware that there is always going to be friction between the judiciary because of its role of the politically elected branches of government, but it must stay within respected and respectable limits.
Bill, what does the Constitution mean to you?
I mean, obviously, as a citizen, it's very important, and I'm grateful to it. And as a grandson of immigrants, I do think the system that the Constitution set up and protects. It's been very important to the flourishing of America in general and the expansion of rights, really, or the greater inclusion of everyone in the rights that the Constitution is designed to protect, and has done a pretty good job over quite a long time now in protecting. I wrote my, I'll just be academic for 60 seconds. I wrote my PhD thesis on the Federalist Papers, and I was thinking about that. I don't think that often about this thesis, and no one else needs to think about it at all. But today is September 17th. It's Constitution Day because that's the day that the Constitutional Convention adjourned. I guess 39, I think it is, of the members signed the Constitution, and it was sent off to the states to be ratified. But it is important. So on the one hand, some of those, fair number of those people were lawyers, if we could talk about that, and they used their legal training and background to think through some of the constitutional provisions, and there are many legal phrases in the Constitution, and also in the Bill of Rights, of course. But it is interesting. We celebrate September 17th, which is appropriate, but it didn't take effect, of course, until it was ratified by the states, which meant the state legislatures, who were elected by the public. So it's also a reminder that the Constitution can be, intelligent people can devise these checks and balances and so forth, but they have to be accepted by the public. And it took a while. In Federalist Papers, we think of correctly as a wonderful explanation of the principles of the Constitution, but they were also designed, each of them begins to the people of New York, and they were designed to convince the citizens of New York and the legislators of New York to ratify the Constitution, which was by no means a certain thing. And so we should, the public support for the Constitution is as important, really, in a way, as the intelligent devising and application of it by lawyers and judges and other elected officials.
Eric?
Well, I want to pick up where Bill just left off. I think the Constitution, to me, ultimately is an invitation to the people to take responsibility. That's really what it boils down to. We think about it as a document of rights and an enshrinement of rights and a limitation on the powers and reach of government, and it is. But as Bill just articulated there, starting with the actual debate on ratification, and it's worth, by the way, us reading not just the Federalist Papers, but the Anti-Federalist Papers, which define a lot of our politics right now, actually. The arguments for and against a government that overreaches, which it turns out partisans of either side can find trouble in. But the essence of this idea of responsibility taking is, to me, central here, that whatever words a constitution sets forth, whatever structures it promises, there's a magical thing in a democracy that you take for granted, just like, water to fish, until it begins to disappear, and that is legitimacy. And what makes a constitution legitimate, what makes those words animated, is whether we take responsibility for animating them, whether when we see them, the concepts and the notions of the rule of law being violated, whether we don't simply spectate and say, oh my gosh, I'm doom scrolling, this is terrible, I'm losing hope and despair, won't somebody fix this? But rather to say, what can I do where I live to raise my voice, to activate other people in other professions, not just lawyers, to say, this is not okay, and that we own not just the responsibility, but the opportunity to give this experiment one more round for one more generation. That's what it means to me.
Thank you all. I mean, y'all spoke really beautifully about kind of setting the background and the base value of the Constitution and the environment it creates for us, how it has had the flexibility to welcome those who weren't welcome at the founding. And those are beautiful, important, sweeping considerations. But I'd like to take a few minutes to just talk about what does it mean in the daily lives of people practically? Maybe people who don't think much about government or politics or the Federalist Papers, either sort of in small ways that are defensive or affirmative. What would you say it matters to an individual? Maybe we'll start with Maria before we lose her. We don't have your microphone on.
Forgive me. Just very quickly, I would say the Constitution is enshrined the right to be at peace in your own home, And I think at the moment we are watching, if someone comes to your door, they have to show ID, that, your protections against search and seizure of not just of your property, but of your person. And I think right this very minute, for some segment of our population, that protection is very much in doubt. But on another is, for example, the democratic process, which I alluded to earlier in terms of making this, we as a people our elected officials made a decision and enacted things like Medicaid to help low income with health care, or SNAP to help the food insecure. That is a direct reflection of the process by which we made decisions that affects people's lives. And I could go on, but I think that too often, especially we as lawyers, we talk about the Constitution and rights as some sort of theoretical thing, but it really does matter in every person's daily lives. And I welcome this opportunity to educate our public.
Yeah. How about Bill? You spoke about human flourishing, which is a concept that's really important. But how do you think about that on a more granular level of individuals and families?
As I say, I studied it, and I was interested in common law when I was a political science professor, and was interested in these constitutional debates when I got to Washington, though not a lawyer. Participated in them a little bit. But for me, actually, serving in the White House from 1989 to January 20th, 1993, when we were kicked out and replaced by Maria and her friends, and I guess Eric too, actually. Yeah. So that actually itself, incidentally, is not a trivial thing, right? We just all took it for granted. I remember working with, meeting with, I was Vice President Quayle's chief of staff, meeting with incoming Vice President Gore's chief of staff to arrange, just the mechanics of the transition. It was totally taken for granted that this would happen. And, not every relationship was personally, as ours was cordial, but not sometimes there's a little tiny bit of tension from the campaign, but we didn't even occur to us, honestly. I really want to say in the United States that there would be a problem with the transition in some fundamental sense. So that shows, so one takes it too much for granted. But I was very struck traveling a bit to Central and Eastern Europe with Vice President Quayle after the wall came down. How much in just conversations with people there, they were talking about their lives a year or two before at this point, right? And how they had none of these they couldn't take any of these constitutional protections for granted. Some of them had been jailed for exercising, obviously, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Others they never had a chance to vote for their leaders. And for them, it was so important and exciting, and there were lessons to be learned, but of course, not wishing to have freedom of speech and equal opportunity and the right to vote isn't the same as setting up structures that defend that and maintain that. And so they tried to learn lessons from us, and some of the lessons I hope were useful. Others, other countries, a lot of countries actually did pretty well, but a few faltered and stuff, and maybe some of the lessons weren't applicable. But it really brought home to me just, these people who were so impressive and so committed now to building liberal democracies and the rule of law in their countries. They really brought home to me what it would be like what it had been like to live in a country where those things couldn't be taken for granted, and indeed were not even honored in the breach, which has sometimes been the case in the U.S.
And thank you, Bill. Judge Duncan, you spent your time on the bench as an appellate lawyer, surrounded by some of the brightest legal minds in the country, developing doctrine and looking deep into precedents and the constitutional debates at the founding. But you've also done some public speaking since you've left the bench. And how do you make these concepts, how do you connect them for regular folks who aren't lawyers and haven't had that experience of deep reading in the law?
One of the things I do is to ask them to give a great deal of thought to rights that they have taken for granted without being aware of it. I taught my grandson that if he were ever pulled over by the police and he didn't, he wasn't speeding extraordinarily, which was a big question, but that he thought he was obeying the law. I said, well, ask the police officer, how would you articulate the probable cause for this stop? Because racial profiling was a very real thing. And it's interesting that I have sort of become, and I have to use the word complacent. These issues had not troubled me lately, and they are coming to the fore now. The Supreme Court justices sit on the circuits, or can sit on the circuits when they retire. And I had the privilege of sitting on a panel with Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who took the opportunity to also speak to our law clerks. Now, the fact that she will not preside, so I was presiding and she was to my right, and of course, nobody in the room paid the slightest bit of attention to me, even to the extent of recognizing that I had a question. But one of the things that she stressed when she was talking to the law clerks, and it's just so vivid now, what they do not know, what they take for granted, what the rule of checks and balances is. And I saw it with the Senate confirmation process. As you know, Constitution gives the Senate the right to be heard, the right to advise and consent. These concepts aren't just words, they have meaning. And I think we have an obligation, and the coalition feels this very strongly, to speak up and make people aware of those roles and those respective responsibilities.
Thank you, Judge. I have one more question in this line before I turn it over to Mary. But this is for Eric, and just continuing what we're talking about here. I admire your work a great deal. I think a lot of our dysfunctions and problems we have in America today stem from kind of a crisis of civics, a crisis of citizenship. So can you just kind of add to what the judge was just saying there? How do we teach Americans, particularly non-lawyers, about why all these things matter and how they can engage and make their citizenship count?
You know, I love this line of questioning, Greg, and I think to pick up on what everybody said, the simplest, most tangible way is to uh, look at the world through the lens of the Constitution for a single day. Like when I get up and wake up, I am here in the United States. I'm the son of immigrants, and I have United States citizenship by virtue of the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment. And that is, again, newly contested these days, but that is a notion right there that allows my presence as a United States citizen. I walk out the door. And in a time like this, as both Maria and Judge Duncan have alluded to, as somebody who's Chinese American in a time where China and America are in increasing tension, the question of is my bodily safety assured, either from search or seizure or from government agents? That's a question that increasingly I and others will have to contemplate. If I walk through my neighborhood and I notice that a stretch of my neighborhood that used to be shops and small businesses is now being condemned and taken over because the city of Seattle wants to build a park there or build something there. Well, I can get mad about that and think, well, who said they could do that? And the answer is, well, the Fifth Amendment, the takings clause of the Constitution says that government, as long as they provide just compensation, can take private property. Well, I didn't know how and then just as I go through my life, and if I go to a workplace and suddenly businesses that I had relied on in my community are shutting down because they can't get their supplies or their products at the same cost they used to be able to, because economic policy changes have unfolded, for instance, tariffs. Well, now there's a constitutional debate about does the power to extend and levy tariffs without congressional involvement, does that comport with the Constitution? So everything that is touching my everyday life, not even in to say nothing of the thing we're gathered here a few days after a week after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And debates about speech and free speech that are everywhere around us right now. And what is free speech? Is there such a thing as hate speech? These are not abstract conceptions. They are arguments that unfold from the seed planted in the Constitution, again, for which we have to take some responsibility of knowledge, and as Judge Duncan said, of not being complacent about and taking for granted and understanding where's my own mind on this? Where do I stand on this? And what am I willing to spend in effort and social capital to defend what I think is the rule of law. And so these things flow through the course of our everyday lives in how we move, speak, worship, do business, do commerce, and engage with each other in a community. They're not high academic notions.
Well, this has been great, and I know you all have talked about what the Constitution means to you, and we've talked a little bit about you don't have to be a lawyer to understand the importance of how the Constitution impacts your day-to-day life. But we've also talked about people being unaware and people being complacent, as the judge mentioned. So what are some of the threats to the Constitution that people may not really be aware of or realize that it's a threat? I'll start with you, Bill. I know there's been a lot of threats to, as Eric mentioned, free speech and the media. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the media. I edited a magazine for 20 years. I'm an editor-at-large of the Bulwark, so I'm maybe a little more sensitive to those and the degree of attempted harassment of the media and lawsuits, not just threatened, but real lawsuits, both criminal and civil, and therefore, and unfortunately, media corporations, I think, finding it, expedient to settle sometimes and or change course rather than stick up for what they had been doing is a danger. I really remember talking, before the most recent election and before 10 years ago, thinking there were debates about obviously First Amendment protections, Justice Department investigations at times of, national security issues. These were sensitive, and difficult line drawing matters, I think, in some cases, honestly. But that I think is one point I would make, maybe the only point I'll make is we're used to constitutional debates and we want to have constitutional debates. I mean, obviously the Constitution does not interpret itself, and judges have different, very intelligent judges can have very different, and conscientious ones can have different interpretations of the merits and the equities and different, particular issues, particular cases. Sometimes those can get pretty contentious, but we are way beyond that, honestly. We are now in a position of not, unfortunately, having an administration and very unfortunately, not just a sort of talking, but an actual Justice Department, and I think in other parts of the administration that don't even really pretend. Occasionally they push back, and then they pretend to follow kind of constitutional norms. But the rhetoric certainly is way beyond respecting that, and the practice is beyond respecting that. And we have people in the Justice Department explicitly kind of trying to go after institutions, individuals, for purposes of intimidation and more than intimidation, sometimes actual criminal, investigations. So I think that's what I would say, that we need to defend, of course, robust debate and unpopular views of constitutional interpretation and heterodox views of constitutional interpretation. People are entitled to raise issues in court that may be unpopular and out of the mainstream even. A lot of good things have happened that started out of the mainstream. But we are now in a genuine, I think it's fair to say, really an assault on some of the basics of our constitutional order.
One of the foundations of our country is independent judiciary, and that's why, as you know, firsthand, Judge, why federal judges have lifetime appointments, so they're not subject to political whims and eras. But we're seeing an increased, I think, threats, both physical threats and verbal threats against the judiciary. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the implication for our country is given this?
Thank you for the opportunity. I have a very dear friend who is now on the DC Circuit, who was a district court judge in South Carolina, and she had received, by last count, 14 pizzas delivered to her home in the name, delivered to her children, but in the names of the murdered son of Judge Esther Salas.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to conceive of anything more morally repugnant to me. And I was an appellate judge, so I tended to stay away from the fray. I wasn't seen very often. It was a bit of a wake-up call for me to get my first death threat, because I wrote an opinion that upheld the rights of the Westboro Baptist Church to picket GI funerals. Are you familiar with the Westboro Baptist Church? They do the God Hates Fags picketing at the funerals of dead servicemen, and to express what I thought was the unremarkable opinion that the First Amendment exists to protect speech we don't like. And what I'm seeing now is just a complete intolerance of the right to have even principled debate. And I also feel a little as though it should be said that it's not a binary proposition. It's not just Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives. It's everyone who has a right to express an opinion within the bounds that don't raise the threat of harm to someone else. And I just see that violated in multiple directions. And that's what the murder of Charlie Kirk brought home to me in particular. It cuts so many different ways.
Thanks for sharing that, Judge. And I mean, that is just horrendous. And, you know, I'll say just to all the lawyers out there, but to the non-lawyers too. We all need to speak up in defense of judges because oftentimes judges can't do that for themselves because they speak through their opinions, but not outside of that arena. So I'll turn to you, Eric. I know you're out and about talking to people every single day about these issues. You've been doing it for years. And do you see something different about the time, you know, right now? And do you think that the threats that we are discussing are resonating with people? And if not, why?
You know, obviously something is different in our national political culture, but our work at Citizen University is really fundamentally focused on what we call civic catalysts who are rooted in their communities, where there's still a sense of place and local relationships and just humanizing ties that make it harder for people to just go to extreme two-dimensional caricatures and demonization of people they might disagree with. And so I think you know, some of this national virus has not fully infected people living in communities around the country, and yet at the same time, one of the things that you know, to your earlier question of what are the things that can slow or stop some of these threats to not only the judiciary but the rule of law. You know, I think the deepest threat to me is, look, the Constitution contemplates an executive who's going to push every limit they can and going to want to kind of aggrandize power as much as they possibly can. The greatest check that the Constitution contemplates for that is, and the reason why it's Article 1, is the Congress. The legislative branch is meant to actually be a balance to an overreaching executive. It is the nature of executive power concentrated inherently to want to seek more. But a legislative branch that is closer to the people is supposed to actually, you know, contain that. And I think part of what we're seeing in this time right now is a Congress that has been all too compliant in executive overreach. And that has been true in, you know, in past recent eras too. This is it's especially exacerbated under the current administration, but didn't begin here. But I think the other bulwark, if I can use, you know, Bill, that your branded name there, against these kinds of threats, does come back to everyday Americans. You know, and so the people we work with at Citizen University are trying in a way that's relevant to their place to learn how to practice power and cultivate civic character. And they embody, you know, I think about Judge Duncan, your predecessor on the, you know, on the federal bench, Judge Learned Hand, who 80 years ago gave a famous speech on the spirit of liberty, right? And the gist of it basically was that, you know, liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. And when it dies there, he said, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. While that spirit of liberty lies there, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it. And I think part of what we try to do at Citizen University, again, not in a con law 101 kind of class, but is just to simply remind the people we work with that what you're trying to do and even trying to ask and practice civic imagination to say, what could be different in my town that is segregated or that is disfavored in this way or that is facing these problems? What could be different? And how could I organize other people to change things in my community? That itself is an act of animating the spirit of liberty. And that taking responsibility, but then converting that sense of I should do something into actual action is what the Constitution both permits and, in a sense, silently demands that we do. The more we do that, the more a Congress, look, Congress at the elected leaders are usually, you know, inappropriately named. What they are more often than leaders is exquisitely attuned followers. They will follow where the heat is. They will follow where the pressure is. And if there are more people in our communities around the country who are saying the rule of law matters to us. We need to have some basic decency and fairness here in the way government works. We'll get a Congress that will be less compliant. But I think, those are the longer term ways that we stave off these acute threats.
Could I just add a word, since you mentioned the Leonard Hand speech, which I very much like and taught, I remember way back when in political science classes. So if I'm not mistaken, that speech he gave in, I think, 1944, he was a moderately conservative jurist, and might have been expected to be sympathetic, therefore, to some of the wartime curtailments of freedoms here at home, some of which may have been really necessary at a time of war, others probably ill-advised and unfortunate. But he went out of his way, I think. I mean, I think it was, I don't know if it was Literally Memorial Day or something like that. Or
It was I Am an American Day. It was a naturalization ceremony in Central Park.
Yes, but it was sort of supposed to be a celebration, obviously, which is fine, of Americanism and so forth. And I think he went out of his way, without quite saying it, to remind people that American wasn't just about, it was certainly about fighting our enemies and certainly about being proud to be an American and so forth, but it was also very much about civil liberties and respect for the rule of law at a time when there were temptations to push beyond that, or also actual, legitimization of that by the Supreme Court. So it's that speech is striking, both for its content, but also for the fact that he chose to give it. He didn't have to. He could have given a totally anodyne naturalization ceremony speech, and he chose to give a speech that he was a little bit against maybe trying to correct some of the prevailing sentiments.
May I follow up on the follow-up?
Yes, of course.
When I was thinking about today, as I told you, Mary, I decided to go back and listen to a 13-minute speech that President Eisenhower gave after the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education, because it was very much at the forefront of my mind. And President Eisenhower was notably not unsympathetic, but not supportive. He chose not to speak out or acknowledge the opinion anyway. He was clearly not on board with the rationale. But he came back and he tried to work with Governor Faubus to peaceably integrate the school system in Little Rock. But he was forced to a point of decision. And he came back from a vacation in Rhode Island and chose to speak in the White House, in the Oval Office, with all of the gravitas that combines, to say it is not acceptable for politically elected branches of government to ignore what the Supreme Court has said with respect to the rule of law. And the fact that he was so clearly not on board philosophically, but nevertheless recognized the Supreme Court's primacy in that regard, it actually brought tears to my eyes. And my fear in all of this, and we've alluded to it somewhat, and I referenced it with the term complacency, is that there is so much of it now that people will become almost anesthetized. Oh, well, okay, I guess 600 people who've been living here under a visa constraint can suddenly have it reversed, or, oh yeah, well, I guess it's okay that, but collectively, it is not okay. And if we get used to it, it is ultimately the saddest thing that could happen.
Yeah, and I wanted to just ask you, Judge, I know you mentioned during our prep call, one of your colleagues, Judge Wilkinson, and I mentioned that judges do speak through their opinions. Did you want to talk to a recent opinion that Judge Wilkinson on the Fourth Circuit wrote?
On the off chance that there's anybody in the speaking world who hasn't read Judge Wilkinson's opinion, and as I told Mary, he is a very dear friend, and I heard of the opinion within seconds after its issuance. He is notable for who and what he is. Not only is he brilliant and a phenomenal writer, but he is a strong conservative, a strong advocate for the rule of law and the primacy of the Constitution. And because of who he is, what he said carried weight that no one else could have spoken, with the authority that he brought to bear in telling, in saying, Justice Abreja Garcia, sorry, the detainee, Amber Alert. The detainee is entitled to the due process of law. Surely the president, having made a mistake in sending him out of the country, can correct the mistake by bringing him back. And to say that is beyond the authority of the court, this district court, and now the Court of Appeals to affirm, has no basis in law. And because of who he is and the strength of his words, which I cannot do justice to, people listened. I wrote him and I said, okay, so this is an unabashed fan letter. But no one else, his writing is so beautiful. All I can do is to commend to those of you who have not read it, his exhortation to following the rules as they are laid down by the Constitution. The executive executes, Congress is supposed to, when it's doing its job, legislate, and the courts stand as the arbiter between the rights of the whole and the rights of the individual.
Thank follow up on that. That is beautiful. I thought that opinion was, I wholeheartedly agree. It's a very important opinion to read. And as coming from the conservative legal world, I'm really moved by it and eager to share it with all of my friends and colleagues. But so one of the important things the Constitution does is restrict what the government can do, even things we might want it to do. Right now, Republicans are in power in the White House and in Congress, and maybe a lot of Republican voters are feeling frustrated with the courts stopping things they want to see happen. So how do we, or how do you, maybe I'll start with Bill, my fellow Republican here, conservative. How do you talk to conservative voters who are bristling at the courts making it difficult to do things they might want to see the government do? I mean, how do you get citizens to, maybe this is a question for everybody. How do you get citizens to understand that it's still good for them if the courts restrain a government that they elected and are, whose agenda they are rooting for?
I would like to speak to that too after
I
Bill.
will take all comers.
Why don't you go first, Judge? You've thought a lot about this.
I have thought a lot about this. I am a Republican. I have expressed and endured a fair amount of pushback for expressing serious reservations about affirmative action. And one of the things that one of the stories I have told that seems to get traction is my favorite play of all times was A Man for All Seasons. And there's this incredible dialogue between the primary actor and Will Thorpe about, would you level the law? Would you flatten the law to catch the devil? And the young firebrand said, I'd lay waste to every law in England to do that. And the wise old man turned around and said, and when you have leveled every law in the country to catch the devil, what serves to protect you when the devil turns around? And who can say it better than that? Okay, so maybe affirmative action is not fully consistent with this language, but once you give a little, once you push a little here and push a little there, what is left to protect you when the good intent is gone? Sorry.
I don't know if anybody can add to that, but if you want to try, Bill.
That was excellent. I would just make I am struck that I think there's been much too little pushback, honestly, from Republican elected officials who also take an oath to the Constitution if they're members of Congress and have taken oaths if they're former officials from the executive branch or Congress. And so and they should show some leadership. I take Eric's point that they're not often it's followership, but it's easier for the voters to see that something's wrong if someone they have voted for, literally, and someone they've heard of and someone they've maybe admired and is objecting. So I think that's been a big problem of breaking through directly to the voters who are not focused 24/7, understandably, on politics. But I am struck the recent comments by the president, the vice president, the attorney general, all of which blur the line. I think we can say charitably between protected speech and hate speech, and then use hate speech very generally to be speech they don't like, or speech that might have one or two inaccuracies in it, or that might be distasteful even. An article in a magazine suddenly makes, that I don't believe there's any legal actions brought against it. I think it's mostly one or two things I wouldn't have put the way this person did, and maybe several things I wouldn't have put that way, one or two that maybe were a tiny blurring of the facts, but well within, I would say, protected speech. Suddenly a funder of an institution connected to that magazine is supposed to be subject to criminal prosecution. I am struck that there's been some, pardon this phone in the background, there's been some pushback from conservatives. There's enough libertarianism left, I think. Enough conservatives remember that they don't really want the federal government to be aggressively going after not protected speech and those who might have encouraged or funded an institution that engages in protected speech. And so I do think that there's some resonance there of a more, straightforward, in a way, First Amendment type argument that this is not, we do not want to live in a country where whoever comes into power at the federal level or in your state can suddenly, decide that I don't like this speech. There's one, thing in it that's tasteless. This organization is associated with the person who published or funded or was the platform for this speech, and suddenly we're going after all of you guys to put you out of business. So I think there's some ability to make that argument on the conservative side.
Greg, if I could just name something that is implicit in this conversation, and now even in the composition of our panel, I think it is notable and important that just even today, so many prominent people from the world of principled conservatism are articulating these ideas about the rule of law, and that our work at Citizen University is cross-ideological, and we're trying to build these cross-partisan coalitions in defense of both the rule of law, but more in an everyday sense, the practice of civic power. And I think you heard my bio. I worked for President Clinton. My views are left generally, and what I will say is that we're in a moment right now that is, if you want to look at the silver lining, a moment of opportunity, because there are a lot of progressives who I know and work with closely who are suddenly now seeing the wisdom of long ago speeches from principled conservatives about the dangers of an overreaching, over-aggressive federal government. They're suddenly attuned to the virtues of limited government. They're suddenly attuned to the powers and the wisdom inherent in federalism. And, I think what Judge Duncan, what you alluded to at the outset in quoting A Man for All Seasons, is this simple thing that is easy to forget in a time like this where everybody's consumed in the combat of the moment. And that is, it's essentially a civic political golden rule. If you didn't know what party you were going to be in, it's the golden rule plus John Rawls. If you didn't know what party you were going to be in, and you had a veil of ignorance about, what side you were going to get plopped on, what kinds of procedural structural protections would you want from concentrated power? And what protections would you want for your freedom and your idea of liberty? And I think, it's one thing for progressives to say that right now, but that can be somewhat dismissed as, well, that's just Democrats who wish they were back in power. But when principled conservatives and libertarians and people from the right are making the case that so many of you are making here, I think it carries outsized weight in a time like this. And, Mary, as you alluded to, I mean, the task force itself that has convened us here today was a product of an initiative at the American Bar Association during your presidency of the ABA, and it was co-chaired by a conservative and a more liberal person, Judge Ludig, Michael Ludig, highly esteemed, just like you, Judge Duncan, and just like Judge Wilkinson and others.
And both former colleagues.
Yes, and Jay
Oh, yeah.
Johnson, a former Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, and I think that, but these conversations, again, can't just be at this elite level of federal appointees and so on and so forth. One of the products of this task force has been a set of discussion guides that we've created for non-lawyers. Lawyers, too, can use them. And in fact, lawyers, I think, bear an extra responsibility to lead conversations in their communities at kitchen tables, at PTAs, and so forth. But the discussion guide is simply drawn from the question that's on the US naturalization exam that immigrants have to take to become US citizens. And it's not how many states are there, who was the first president, what's the longest river in the United States. It's actually this ringer of a question, which is, what is the rule of law? And most Americans right now, even if we're exercised by what's going on in the news, could not plainly, simply answer that question, what is the rule of law? And the naturalization exam, at least as it currently exists, gives several authorized answers. No one is above the law. The government must obey the law. Everybody must follow the law. And it unpacks what that means both in history and, as we were speaking earlier, in everyday contemporary life in our community lives. And to be able to take that question, that set of discussion points, and say, well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the rule of law. But particularly for those of you who come from right of center, for you to lead those conversations the way that you all are doing right here, I think is what we've got to see in every community in this country right now.
Well, you raised a great point, Eric, about the naturalization services and how people wanting to become citizens of this country learn about it and take ownership of it. And I guess what I view is a lot of people are not, they feel like these threats that we've talked about today, they're over here, they're not impacting me. Like my relatives haven't been picked up on the street without due process. I haven't seen any impact on my life. And how do you get people to realize that they need to work collectively, even if they haven't seen the impact to themselves directly, kind of what the judge alluded to, in the play. Eric, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think one of the basic things we teach in our work at Citizen University is a conception of citizenship that we don't mean United States citizenship, legal documentation status. We mean this broader ethical sense of being a member of the body. The same colloquial sense that we mean when we call somebody a good citizen, right? When we say that person's a good citizen, we didn't check their passports or their papers. We just saw their acts and their way of living in community. And we boil down that conception into a simple equation, which is power plus character equals citizenship. To live like a citizen in this sense means to be literate in power, to understand who decides things, how things work. And that's both a constitutional framework for the rule of law, but it's also just when you get down to your community, who decided that this neighborhood should be turned into a light rail station? Who decided that these schools should be shut down or opened? Who decided about these questions? And most people have a very simple answer to that question, which is they. I can't believe they decided to do these things. And part of the responsibility that we have to take on Constitution Day is to remember there is no they. The Constitution invites us to form many different overlapping circles of we who are involved in those processes of decision, either directly or indirectly. And that literacy and power is super important. But then that has to be coupled with the other half of the equation, which is a sense of civic character. And I don't mean only individual virtue and individual, diligence and honesty and so forth. I mean character in the collective. And this goes to the heart of your question, Mary. Civic character is about mutuality. It's about having enough empathy to realize, though I'm not the one who's getting picked up and stopped and having due process denied, I could be tomorrow. And even if I'm not tomorrow, this is an offense to just my own dignity to see somebody who is my neighbor, my colleague, my friend, my relative being assaulted this way. And I think that sense of mutual responsibility is part of a civic character, a set of norms and values that, again, are the glue of what holds us together. The companion to learned Hand, Judge Hand, is from 100 years even before that, when Alexis de Tocqueville was running around the young, United States and observing that as remarkable as, at that time, the 50-year-old Constitution was, that it was really what he called the habits of the heart, habits of heart and mind, that even, again, the limited citizenry of that young white republic at the time, that the habits of heart and mind that people carried of how to practice forbearance with people they might disagree with, how to actually join and build the muscle of associating and creating clubs and participating and not just complaining, having the habit of when you see something that's wrong, beginning to ask, well, how could I be part of fixing that, rather than waiting for someone else, whether government or some powerful local figure, to fix it for you, right? These are habits of heart and mind that we try to teach in our work at Citizen University, and it's not a one and done. When Justice O'Connor left the bench, Judge Duncan, in addition to riding circuit in the way that you were describing, she spent her capital and her time and her energy starting something called iCivics, which started as this wonderful online platform using games to teach civics to, at the time, middle schoolers, and now has become this incredible widespread platform for middle and high school students. And that was taking her particular form of power and standing and converting it into something that could be useful for others. And I think that that's what we each have to do. And so even if, Justice O'Connor wasn't likely ever to get pulled over and stopped and abused by government in a direct way, but she understood that she had all this capital and she shouldn't hoard it. She should circulate it for the good of her country. And I think that's what we all have to do, even if we're not the ones being directly threatened, is to think, how can I circulate my capital so that we have a stronger, more resilient community that can both practice civic power and cultivate civic character in a way that allows us to live together in a diverse society without killing each other. And that's, human history says that's the exception, not the rule. You get this many people from this many backgrounds together in a container, eventually we're all going to kill ourselves, kill each other. That's the default setting. And I think we've got an opportunity to break that pattern.
Well, this has been such a wonderful discussion, but I see that we're running out of time. So I want to give all of you, we have a lot of people listening, both lawyers and non-lawyers, and you all have touched on such important things. Just final thoughts, what you want to leave our audience with. I'll start with you, Judge. You're on mute.
It's interesting. I, for a very long time, have served as Vice President of the International Association of Judges. It's composed of judicial associations from over 90 countries that come together to protect and discuss the rule of law. And one of my roles as president of a vast region that includes North America and Asia and Australia, essentially everything that wasn't Europe, I was called upon to speak on behalf of the association regarding situations that we saw in other countries. And so I was looking through some of my papers the other day, and I saw a letter that I sent to the president of Yemen expressing our concern about the treatment of the judiciary in that country. And in the spring of last year, the association voted to send an expression of concern to the Federal Judges Association in the United States about the circumstances that we are facing here. And I can't think of anything more humbling than to know the world is watching us, and they are not gratified or impressed by what they see.
Thank you, Judge. Bill?
Yeah, the flip side of that point, I would say, is what does it mean to be proud to be an American? To get back to the learned hand thing, it means partly, some of it is self-interest, well understood. If they, we're happy to have the system. If they come for someone else, they could come for us, to use a Tocquevillian phrase. Some of it is empathy, which is very important, and a sense of responsibility for others. And some of it is a kind of pride in that this country has sustained this and this system and expanded it in accordance with the principles of the Declaration and the mechanisms of the Constitution. And I do think appealing to that pride of that is the real grounds of American pride. Not so much, it's great that we're powerful as a nation. It's great that we are wealthy as a nation and all that. But of course, there are other nations in human history that have been very powerful and others in the world that are very wealthy. But the pride in our accomplishment of preserving freedom, this experiment that, as Eric said, was not taken for granted by the founders and shouldn't be by us, and is somewhat rare in our human history. And that I think it's very important to appeal to that in our fellow citizens, not just the kind of, even if you're not directly affected, don't you want yourself to live in and your children to grow up in a country that could be proud of what we've done and not just as another nation that's kind of fallen into the same traps and the same problems and injustices, honestly, that mark most nations most of the time in human history. So I think the pride genuine pride, not a kind of chest beating and not a kind of, glorying in some, blowing up a boat somewhere or something, but genuine pride in what we've accomplished is really important.
And Eric,
You know,
final words
Judge
for our
Duncan
audience.
is basically saying face facts, and Bill is saying take pride. And I would synthesize by saying do both by acting locally. Take these ideas that we've been expressing and sharing here and look around you where you live. You get offline and look around you where you live. Look at the people who surround you where you live, and ask, where do you see the Constitution? Where do you see the rule of law? Where do you see ways in which the civic culture of your place can and should be fortified? And that's where responsibility begins. A lot can be broken in the United States from the top down, but the remedy can only come over time from the bottom up and the middle out. And that's all of us sharing what we're doing here today and continuing to spread it the ways that you all do. So really grateful for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I can't think of a better way to spend Constitution Day. I think we've heard a great discussion about how the Constitution impacts all of us and that all of us have the power to ensure that these protections continue, things we take for granted, that, there's a peaceful transfer of power when a new president is elected, or that when you enter a courtroom, no matter who you are, you will get justice the same as if you're rich, poor, black, white. So thanks so much to all the panelists, to Bill, Eric, Maria, and the judge, and my co-moderator, Greg. And thank you from the Task Force for American Democracy. We have separated from the ABA, and we are a separate organization now. We will be officially launching in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. And if you want to visit us, we're at www.democracy-taskforce.org. So please look forward to future programs that we will be having. Thank you, and happy Constitution Day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.